Imagine growing up in a mansion overlooking the bay, marble floors, giant chandeliers. But inside? It was a different story. Let me tell you why. My name's Ethan, 31 male. I grew up in San Francisco, in this ridiculously massive mansion on a hill overlooking the bay. You know, the marble everywhere, giant chandeliers, and rooms no one even used. Now, don't think I'm bragging or something, because on the outside, it probably looked like we were living the dream, but inside it was freaking cold. Not just the house itself, but the people in it, my parents. My dad, Richard Mercer, was a titan of Silicon Valley. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a force of nature, reshaping industries with his audacious vision and borderline unethical tactics. He donned tailored suits, commanded board meetings that stretched into the early hours, and possessed a voice that could make even the most hardened executives tremble. My mom, Deborah, was his perfect counterpart. She was all about appearances, orchestrating lavish parties where she moved through the crowd like a queen, ensuring every detail was flawless, every conversation strategic. But their picture-perfect life had one fundamental flaw. Me. From as far back as I can remember, I knew I wasn't part of their plan. My parents wanted daughters, 2 of them to be exact. They envisioned a lineage of powerful women, ready to inherit the Mercer Empire and conquer the world. Instead, they got me, a boy, a deviation from their meticulously crafted blueprint. They didn't hide it well either. I wasn't the kid they paraded at their parties. I was the one they tolerated, the silent acknowledgement of a dream unrealized, the living embodiment of their mistake. It wasn't just subtle cues, either. I remember being 5 and overhearing them fight. My mom was yelling at my dad, saying she didn't sign up for this and how she was supposed to have daughters, not this. I didn't understand all the words back then, but I knew enough to realize they were talking about me, that I was somehow a disappointment. My dad tried to calm her down, saying it wasn't her fault and that they could always fix it. I didn't know what fixing it meant until a year later when I was 6. My mom got pregnant. She was glowing, happier than I'd ever seen her. For months, the house buzzed with anticipation, a frantic energy focused on the impending arrival. My mom hired nutritionists, yoga instructors, and even some lady called Allah, a specialist in, well, I never really knew what Allah did, but it involved chanting and crystals, and my mom seemed to think it was essential. When Sophia was born, it was like the entire world shifted on its axis. She was their golden child, their second chance at the dynasty they craved. I'll never forget the day they brought her home. My mom cradled Sophia like she was holding the most precious thing on earth, her eyes shining with an almost fanatical devotion. My dad looked at her with this pride I'd never seen directed at me, a look that said, "This is it, this is what we've been waiting for." I stood there in the corner watching, and I knew I wasn't part of this family anymore. A month later, they sent me to boarding school. They called it an incredible opportunity, a chance to excel, and reach my full potential. They spun tales of academic rigor, lifelong friendships, and unforgettable experiences. But I knew the truth. They didn't want me around. I was 10 years old, and they shipped me across the country like an unwanted package, a problem they'd finally solved. The school was a Gothic monstrosity, a place steeped in tradition and privilege. The other kids were the offspring of old money families, senators, tech moguls, even a few exiled royals. They didn't care that I came from a rich family. They could sense that my parents didn't care about me, and they used that against me. I became the kid everyone picked on, the target of their petty cruelties. They called me the leftover, the mistake, the cipher. In the dining hall, they'd laugh and say stuff like, "Don't sit with Ethan, even his parents didn't want him." I'd laugh it off, trying to project an air of indifference. I was being bullied, but I refused to let them see they were getting to me. But inside, it ate at me, chipping away at my sense of self-worth. Every time they said it, it felt like they were digging a knife a little deeper. The worst part was how much I feared it was true. My parents barely visited, maybe once a year, and even then, it felt like a chore. They'd quiz me about my grades, lecture me about maintaining appearances, and then leave, their minds already on the next board meeting or social event. My mom would spend the whole visit talking about Sophia, her accomplishments, her brilliance, her effortless charm. Meanwhile, I was just there, a ghost in their perfectly curated life. The only person who ever cared, who ever saw me as anything other than a disappointment, was my Uncle Dan. He was my dad's younger brother, a stark contrast to the Mercer Empire. Dan worked at a factory, managing a team of mechanics. He didn't have the money or the prestige my parents had, but he had something they desperately lacked. A genuine heart. Dan would visit me on weekends, driving for hours just to spend a few hours with me. He'd take me to baseball games, get me burgers at this dive diner down the road, and just sit with me talking about life. He didn't lecture or judge. He just listened, offering a quiet, unwavering presence that was more valuable than anything my parents could have given me. For those few hours, I felt like I mattered, like I was seen, like I was worthy. Dan was the closest thing I had to a parent, a lifeline in a sea of indifference. As the years went by, I learned to build walls, to shield myself from the constant rejection. I stopped expecting my parents to care, lowering my expectations until they were practically non-existent. Instead, I threw myself into my studies. I wasn't the most naturally gifted student, but I was driven by a fierce determination to prove myself, to escape the shadow of my family. I excelled in coding and cryptography, finding a sense of control in the intricate patterns and hidden meanings of these complex systems. I figured if I could just make it through, I'd get out of their orbit and build my own life, a life on my own terms. By the time I graduated, I was done with them. They had their perfect family with Sophia, and I was nothing more than an afterthought. So, I made a plan, a silent vow to forge my own path, far away from their toxic influence. I applied to universities far from home, focusing on programs that would hone my skills in cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. When I got into MIT, I jumped at the chance, eager to immerse myself in a world of innovation and intellectual rigor. My dad wired me money for tuition and expenses, a transaction devoid of any warmth or affection, probably relieved to be rid of me for good. I didn't care. I just felt like I was finally in control of my own future. As I boarded the plane heading to Boston, a part of me couldn't shake the weight of it all, the years of being overlooked, the constant feeling of never being enough. It clung to me like a shadow, threatening to drag me back into the darkness. Still, I told myself this was my chance to start fresh, a new city, a new life, and hopefully, a new me. What I didn't realize back then was how deeply entrenched my past was, how inextricably linked I was to the Mercer legacy, and how dangerous it could be to try and break free. Moving to Boston was like stepping into another world. The air crackled with ambition, and I found myself surrounded by brilliant minds, all pushing the boundaries of technology. Nobody here knew my family, nobody knew my past. Nobody looked at me as Ethan, the leftover, or the mistake. I could just be me, an anonymous student, a blank slate. It was liberating, terrifying, and intoxicating all at once. I quickly fell in with a group of like-minded individuals, a motley crew of hackers, coders, and security experts. Brandon was one of the core people, the one you could always count on to help you hack a project or to lift your spirits during your most dire moments. Next to him was Allison Sharp, a coding prodigy with a sharp wit and an even sharper mind. She didn't suffer fools gladly, but she possessed a fierce loyalty to those she trusted. Together, we shared a passion for pushing the limits of technology, a fascination with the hidden world of code and ciphers. We explored the dark corners of the internet, uncovering hidden networks and secret communication channels. We were digital explorers, charting uncharted territories of the information age. One night, while delving into a particularly complex encryption, we stumbled upon something that would change everything. It was a hidden message, a coded communication that seemed to originate from within the Mercer Empire. It was a puzzle, a labyrinth of symbols and ciphers, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to my past. The message, we later discovered, was a dead man's switch. A code sent with the instruction that something was horribly wrong and that steps needed to be taken. With it, there was a secondary set of instructions, steps to take to unlock the door to a file so secret, it was never meant to see the light of day. Through all this, my past wasn't as far behind me as I'd hoped. My parents still had a way of creeping into my life, no matter how much distance I tried to put between us. It started with the occasional messages, updates about Sophia's latest achievements. At first, I ignored the messages, but they kept coming. It wasn't just updates. It was like they were trying to remind me of my place in the family, or lack of one. They didn't care about what I was doing or the life I was building. To them, I was still the mistake they shipped off to boarding school. One day I made the mistake of opening one of those messages. My mom had attached a photo from a recent family event. There was Sophia, standing between my parents, all smiles, in her perfect designer dress. My mom had captioned it, "Our pride and joy." That was it, no mention of me, no sign that I even existed. It stung more than I wanted to admit. There was something else, though, this time. A sense of warning, of impending doom, as if something had shifted, and even Sophia knew it. I showed the email to Brandon and Allison, hoping they'd laugh it off with me, but Allison just shook her head. "They don't deserve you," she said, and for some reason, those words hit harder than any insult my parents ever threw my way. I tried to focus on the code, But life has a way of reminding you that the past doesn't just disappear. It creeps back in when you least expect it. I was sitting at my desk, working to crack the last key to the hidden message when a call came. It was from one of Uncle Dan's co-workers at the factory. He told me Dan had collapsed on the job and was taken to the hospital. I froze. Dan was the one constant in my life, the only person who ever treated me like I mattered. I tried to call the hospital immediately, but by the time I got through to someone, it was already too late. Dan was gone. The news hit me hard. Dan had been my rock during some of the worst years of my life. He wasn't flashy or wealthy, but he was kind. He showed up when no one else did, and for a kid who'd been cast aside, that meant everything. I booked the first flight to his place, barely able to process what had happened. The funeral was small, just a handful of his co-workers and neighbors. My parents didn't come, of course. They hadn't spoken to Dan in years, and I'm sure they didn't even notice he was gone. As I stood there at the service, I felt this overwhelming mix of guilt and anger, guilt that I hadn't visited him more often, that I hadn't called more. Anger at how unfair it all was, how someone like Dan could just disappear while my parents carried on in their perfect, hollow lives. Something seemed amiss though. A shadow hanging over the proceedings, a sense that something was wrong and not all things were being said. It wasn't until later that I realized someone was watching me. After the funeral, I met with Dan's lawyer to go over his will. I wasn't expecting much since lived a simple life in a modest apartment, but what I didn't expect was for him to leave everything to me. His savings, his apartment, and a few personal things, like an old baseball glove we used to play catch with and a stack of handwritten notes he'd kept from my time at boarding school. It wasn't about the money or the stuff, it was about the gesture. Dan saw me as family. He thought of me as someone worth leaving a legacy to. For someone who grew up feeling like they didn't belong anywhere, that meant more than I could put into words. But in the apartment, in the back of a seemingly innocuous picture frame, was a USB. It contained everything. My world was about to be turned upside down. But of course, my parents found a way to ruin even that. A couple of weeks later, I got a letter from their lawyer. They were contesting the will. They were claiming Dan had been mentally unfit when he wrote the will and that the assets should go to them as his closest relatives. I couldn't believe it. My parents had barely acknowledged Dan's existence when he was alive. Now they wanted to swoop in and take what little he left me. I was furious. This wasn't about the money. Dan's estate wasn't worth much in the grand scheme of things. This was about them trying to control me, to take away the one piece of family I had left. They'd already pushed me out of their lives, treated like I didn't exist, and now they wanted to strip away the last bit of connection I had to someone who truly cared about me. I didn't waste any time. I hired a lawyer using some of the savings we'd scraped together from the firm. Brandon and Allison backed me up without hesitation. "We'll figure it out," Brandon said. "You're not fighting this alone." I really appreciated their help. I felt like I finally had people in my corner, people who actually gave a damn about what happened to me. The legal battle was brutal. My parents' lawyers were ruthless. They tried to paint me as some manipulative, ungrateful kid who'd taken advantage of a sick man. They dug up everything they could to discredit me, even going so far as to claim I wasn't emotionally stable enough to manage an inheritance. It was exhausting, both mentally and emotionally. Every time I walked into the courtroom, I felt like I was reliving all the years of rejection and dismissal I'd endured growing up, but I wasn't alone this time. Allison helped me organize documents and go through witness lists late into the night, while Brandon used his network to connect us with people who could speak to Dan's character and how close we were together. But it was more than that now. Something felt wrong. What was on that USB? We built a case that showed the truth. That Dan loved me like a son and that his decision to leave me everything was his and his alone. After months of back and forth in court, the judge finally ruled in my favor. Dan's will was upheld, and my parents' case was dismissed. It was time to open the USB. I just felt empty. Winning didn't bring Dan back. It didn't erase the pain of losing him or the bitterness of having to fight for something that should have been simple. The worst part was seeing my parents in the courtroom. My mom sat there stone-faced, not even pretending to care about the truth. For her, this wasn't about Dan or his estate, it was about punishing me for stepping out of line. My dad barely said a word the entire time. He just looked tired, like he was going through the motions because my mom told him to. When the trial ended, my mom walked past me without a word, and my dad paused for a moment like he wanted to say something, but then he followed her out the door. That was the last time I saw them in person. After the case, I sold Dan's apartment, keeping only a few personal items that reminded me of him. The money went into the firm, giving us a much-needed boost to grow the business, but no amount of work could fill the hole he'd left behind. Dan had been the only real family I'd ever had, and now he was gone. Allison and Brandon watched over me as I entered in a series of passwords for the file. This was it. What was at stake? What I learned changed my life forever. The file was a trove of encrypted documents, video logs, and audio recordings, each one a piece of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. But I couldn't look away. Dan, my steadfast, unassuming uncle, had been leading a double life. He wasn't just a factory manager, he was a whistleblower, a guardian of secrets, and now, posthumously, my reluctant mentor. The core of the file detailed Richard Mercer's illegal activities. It wasn't just insider trading, which was bad enough, but something far more insidious. Mercer was using his vast technological resources to develop a sophisticated surveillance program, capable of monitoring every digital communication in San Francisco. He called it Project Chimera, and its stated purpose was to prevent terrorism. But Dan's files revealed a darker motive: to control the city's political landscape, suppress dissent, and consolidate power. He sees himself as a benevolent dictator, Dan had written in one of his notes. But power corrupts, Ethan. And Richard has always had a thirst for control. The worst part? Sophia was involved. Video logs showed her attending meetings, strategizing with Richard, her youthful face betraying a chilling ambition. She wasn't just the golden child. She was his accomplice. I felt sick. Betrayed. My family, the people I had desperately wanted to connect with, were monsters. What was I supposed to do? We have to expose this, Allison said, her voice tight with anger. This is a violation of everything we stand for. Brandon nodded, his laid-back demeanor replaced with a fierce resolve. We can't let them get away with it, but we have to be careful. They'll be watching us. We knew we were walking into a war. Richard Mercer had unlimited resources, powerful connections, and a willingness to do anything to protect his empire. We were just 3 coders with a USB drive full of secrets. We decided to leak the files to a reputable investigative journalist, someone we could trust to handle the information responsibly. But before we could make contact, we were attacked. Our office was raided, our equipment was seized, and we were forced to go into hiding. Someone knew what we had, and they were willing to kill to get it back. We managed to escape, thanks to Brandon's hacking skills and Allison's quick thinking. We found refuge in a hidden network of activists and hackers, a community of digital rebels who were dedicated to fighting for freedom and justice. They offered us shelter, resources, and a safe haven from the storm. You're not alone. Their leader, a woman named Maya, told us. There are others who want to see Mercer brought down. We'll help you. With their support, we began to plan our counterattack. We knew we couldn't confront Richard directly. He was too powerful, too well protected. We had to find a way to expose his crimes to the world, to turn public opinion against him. We decided to use Project Chimera against him. We would hack into the system, expose its capabilities, and reveal his true motives. It was a dangerous plan, but it was our only chance. The risks were enormous. If we were caught, we could face years in prison, or worse. But we couldn't back down. We had a responsibility to Dan, to the people of San Francisco, and to ourselves. As we prepared for our final assault, I received a message from Sophia. She wanted to meet alone. I hesitated. Could I trust her? Was she setting me up? But something in her message, a hint of desperation, convinced me to take the risk. I met her in a secluded park, far from the watchful eyes of her father. She looked tired, haunted by what she had seen and done. I can't do this anymore, Ethan, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't be a part of his lies. She revealed that Richard had become increasingly paranoid, obsessed with controlling every aspect of her life. He had used Project Chimera to monitor her every move, tracking her communications, spying on her friends. She felt trapped, suffocated by his control. I want to help you, she said. I want to bring him down. I was wary, but I listened. She gave me valuable information about Project Chimera's security protocols, weaknesses that we could exploit. She also told me about a hidden server, a backup system that contained even more damaging evidence. It was a risky gambit, but it was worth a shot. With Sophia's help, we launched our final attack. We used her inside knowledge to bypass the system's defenses, exposing its capabilities to the world. The public outcry was immediate and deafening. Richard Mercer was branded a tyrant, a power-hungry megalomaniac who had betrayed the trust of the people. The authorities launched an investigation, seizing his assets, arresting his accomplices, and dismantling Project Chimera. Richard Mercer's empire crumbled before our eyes. He didn't go down without a fight. He used his remaining resources to try and silence us, hiring mercenaries to hunt us down. But we were ready for him. We had built a network of allies, people who believed in our cause and were willing to fight for it. In a final showdown, we confronted Richard in his own mansion, the place where my nightmare had begun. It was a brutal and emotional battle, a clash between the past and the future. Richard, desperate and unhinged, tried to justify his actions, claiming that he was only trying to protect the city. But his words rang hollow. We were able to subdue him, turning him over to the authorities. As he was led away in handcuffs, he looked at me with a mixture of hatred and regret. "You'll never understand," he said. "I did it all for you, Ethan. For our family." I just shook my head. "There's nothing left of our family," I said. "You destroyed it all." In the aftermath, we worked to rebuild the city's digital infrastructure, ensuring that such a violation of privacy could never happen again. Sophia testified against her father, playing a pivotal role in his conviction. It was a difficult decision, but she knew it was the right thing to do. My mom, Deborah, retreated into a world of denial, refusing to acknowledge her husband's crimes. She lived in a bubble of wealth and privilege, unable to face the consequences of her actions. It was a long and difficult journey, filled with pain, loss, and betrayal. But in the end, we prevailed. We emerged from the shadows, stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to fight for what was right. We honored the legacy of Uncle Dan, the quiet hero who had risked everything to protect the truth. Lately I got a package. It was from Uncle Dan's old apartment. Something I must have missed when I cleared it out. Inside was a framed photo of us at a baseball game and a note he'd written years ago. It just said, "Proud of you, kid." That photo's on my desk now, a daily reminder of where I started and how far I've come. Dan believed in me when no one else did, and I like to think he's still rooting for me. My parents, they're still out there stuck in their bubble of wealth and fake smiles, but they don't have any power over me anymore. I've built something real. I hope they finally have some peace. I finally do.